Und jetzt ein Tipp eins mit Unseen Run by Julie Report.
Good afternoon. My name is Aaron Dely. I'm the head of R&D for PLD Pharma Solutions. And today we're going to talk about the strategies and solutions for launching OTC and RX gummies. So why gummies? They drive compliance. Currently, gummies are the second best-selling dosage form in the VMS space. They're just behind tablets and just in front of the sales of soft gels. Tablets have traditionally been the most sold version of VMS products, typically because of their low cost of manufacturing and because they're easy to produce. You can achieve very high drug loads with tablets as opposed to soft gels and with gummies. And we'll talk about some more of that a little bit later. But one of the things that we're really concerned about is they do, with their lower drug load, they do command a higher price at the retail space. So they are more expensive to produce, but is the consumer willing to pay for that? And the answer is yes. On average, the consumer is willing to pay about 30% more in the US for a gummy product as opposed to a tablet, and they're willing to pay about 5% premium for a gummy product over a soft gel. Those are just on the averages. I pulled up a couple of very popular VMS products over the weekend and looked at them at various retailers throughout the US, Walmart, Walgreens, and CVS, and some of them were even double the amount for gummies that as opposed to their tablet counterpart on a per unit basis. So what are the challenges that we have for bringing these gummies in both the OTC and the RX side to commercialization? It's been done in the VMS category before, but it hasn't been done for a very long time, at least in the OTC and in the RX side. So we're going to talk about several of these items today that are listed here. API suitability. We're going to talk about stability. We're going to talk about the major issue that I've come into contact with, which is taste masking. And we're going to talk about dosage accuracy and loading, which is something that's a very big driver from the regulatory bodies. We're going to talk about the manufacturing costs, but we're going to start at the end. I'm going to start at the end with the regulatory approvals. So there may be several people from the science end of things, like I am in the room, who've been dealing with gummies on the OTC side for a very long time, but you've not ever brought anything to market. And a big reason for that is because a lot of the regulatory uncertainty that has existed. Will they be acceptable to the regulatory bodies in order to launch something like this? One of the biggest things we've always heard about is, their gummies they're too much like candy, and that pediatrics and children, that it's going to be a big problem getting through the regulatory bodies in order to launch it because of the adverse effects on children. So we already know that several companies are working on and are going to bring OTC gummies to market. This is a fact. It's happening in the US for sure. We already know that at least one IND has been filed. There's probably been more, and there's several 505(b)(2)s in progress. So we know that they're coming. We know that all these years of R&D expenditure are going to pay off at some point. They're going to be launched into the market. Why is this? Well, there's a couple reasons, in my opinion, that this has happened. First of all, the FDA did have a webinar coming up on a couple of years ago now where they addressed some of these concerns. And I, like a lot of people, was tuned into that webinar, and I was thinking that this was going to solve all of my questions, that they were going to answer everything, that it was going to be clear sailing from there. But in true FDA fashion, they muddied the waters a little bit. They didn't give us any real clear answers on what they were going to do, but that was a good sign because they didn't say that they were going to take them off the market. One of the things that has always been a regulatory concern in gummies, bringing them in the OTC side of the business, is are they going to require a change to the monograph? Because it is sort of a new dosage form, or are they going to see this as a tablet, a solid dosage form, and grandfather all of these products under the existing monograph? And their lack of addressing that issue in that webinar really kind of signaled that they were going to let this proceed. So what did they really talk about in that? What did they give us at that webinar that we could take home? One of the things that they talked about was the safety. They were very adamant about safety, which we all know about. We thought they were going to really home in on the flavors, but they said it's going to follow the normal regulatory pathway that we have with any other flavor, with any other dosage form, whether it's a liquid product or what have you. You're going to need to run it off of the tox study. You're going to need to break down each individual component of that complex ingredient of the flavor, and it's going to need to have the safety and toxicity data to support that level of flavor. So that was a big win in our minds. They did present a whole lot of data with regards to the abuse and some of the adverse reactions that have happened, some of the accidental overdoses that had taken place. And they presented several slides on the statistics of that, not only from the pediatric side of accidental overdoses with OTC products, but also with the general population. The numbers are staggering in the US. How many people end up in the hospital with accidental overdoses due to OTC products? So they were very, very, very concerned about the safety, which means you need to figure out how to child-proof everything has to be a child-proof packaging. And even in a lot of cases, even in blister packaging is what we came away with this. But it was a good win for us. Now, the other thing that happened in the space that's really launched people forward is that you could see the one sitting right there, the fourth one in, Equate. Walmart, Equate's brand Walmart, decided to launch an acetaminophen product in a gummy. Now, I wouldn't have actually started with that, seeing as that the FDA's biggest concern was accidental overdoses. Probably wouldn't have run out the door with that one with my hair on fire, but that's exactly what Walmart did. And by smashing the proverbial champagne across the bow with acetaminophen, it told us a lot of things because the FDA did not take it off the market. They didn't do much of anything. They let it exist on the market. So with that in mind, with these two facts that came out, a lot of these companies have really changed their attitude, and a lot of companies are really making a strong push towards launching OTCs, 505(b)(2)s, and other non-monograph products. API suitability. So now that we've gotten through all of this, and some of you in the room may be scientists, some of you business development, we've gotten through all this and you realize, okay, the regulatory bodies are going to accept this. There is a market for it. People are going to pay for it. We understand all of the negatives. What other things should we be looking at? One of them is dosage considerations. So as I mentioned before, gummies do not allow you to have the same amount of loading or dosage levels as other solid dosage forms do. Typically, we like to start at about 10% as being our maximum, but it all depends upon the specific drug substance that you're working with. So the typical gummy weighs anywhere from 2 grams to 5 grams. So that puts you at a 200 to 500 milligram active dose for each gummy. Now that's dependent upon several other factors, and one of them is the second one on the list, which is a taste profile. That assumes that you do have a pleasurable taste profile. If you don't, then we're going to talk about other things that are going to come into play that you're going to have to weave into the equation. The aqueous solubility of the API also comes into play. So can you get it into solution? Sometimes you don't even want it in solution if it's got a poor taste profile. The last two things on the list refer to stability. That's the thermal and the pH stability, and we're going to talk about that the next slide because that's a big thing on everybody's mind, especially those of us who come out of a solid dose background where moisture is the biggest enemy to everything. And now here we're going to cook everything in a big kettle with a bunch of water. Sounds like a winner. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind is actually how gummies are made. So essentially what you're doing is you're putting a bunch of water into a pot. You're adding in our case, in the PLD's case, we use pectin. So we're adding pectin, which is our gelling agent, and we're adding all of the soluble substances in there, sugars and whatnot, and even the APIs. And you're allowing these things to hydrate and to dissolve. Typically, you're going to add an overage. You'll start out with about 30% moisture, which is devastating to some APIs. And then you're going to add to the confusion, and you're going to jack up the temperature to 120 to 130 degrees C. And the purpose of that is to boil off the excess water to achieve a final Brix or a final dissolved solids content of about 80 to 85%. So One of the things you want to make sure that you look at is heat sensitivity. Is your API going to be thermally stable enough to handle something like this? Now, all these things that I'm talking about here, they're not non-qualifiers. There are ways, there are methods that we can use in order to get around a lot of these things to a certain extent. So this is not a checklist that'll remove anything off of that. Moisture sensitivity. So as I said before, there's a whole lot of water in there. So you need to make sure that where you're adding the specific API or drug substance is very important, because you're going to have higher or lower levels of moisture depending upon where you are in the cook and where you are in the cooling process. The pH side is also something to be concerned about. As I mentioned earlier, we do deal with pectin gummies. So pectin's a polysaccharide. It's a naturally derived polysaccharide, generally from citrus fruits. It does have negatively charged carboxylic acid groups on the end of it, and those negatively charged groups repel each other, and that's what keeps things from coming together. In the presence of a weak acid, such as a malic acid or a citric acid, the negatively charged carboxylic acid groups protonate, and it reduces the electrostatic repulsion between those chains, and they start to come together to form the gel network. That's how they set up. And they entrap the water, and that's how you get a gummy gel network. But you have to add for protonation, you have to add the weak acid. So when you do that, the pH drops significantly. So typically your final pH is going to be 3 to 3.5 whenever we do that. So your API, your drug substance, it needs to be able to be pH stable in those regions. Microbial. So that's another thing. Again, you've got a bunch of sugars and water, and you just shake your head. Can we possibly add anything more complicated to my target product profile here? So one of the things that is very important is to pay attention to the water activity. So there's a lot of substances that are in the gummy, sugars, the gelling agents that will compete for the water molecules, and therefore will hold on to it, and therefore the water's not free in order to go on and form microgrowth. But either way you look at it, we do perform a whole lot of micro testing, both on the way in and the way out. Achieving consistency. So this is one of the big things. So typically your gummy production has been in the confectionery space for a very long time. Now we're talking about bringing it to RX standards. That's a different beast. Now you're talking about consistency of dose. You're talking about mixing. You're talking about bulk mixing. You're talking about content uniformity, stratified content uniformity. And a lot of the confectionery people that we talked to had no idea what a content uniformity stratified plant looked like. So one of the things that is very important to look at is whether or not you're using a soluble API. If it's got a high aqueous solubility, then it becomes a lot easier. And whether or not you're using a suspension. So we do have several of our APIs, several of our products have APIs that are in suspension. And then, of course, any of the ones that incorporate taste mask technology, typically speaking, they're going to have any sort of a coating or corrosivation or even an ion exchange resin. They're going to be in suspension. And so of different particle sizes, anywhere from 40 to 50 microns up to probably 400 or 500 microns in suspension. So you need to have equipment that is able to handle that, to get it into the suspension quickly, to get a homogeneous mix, and then transfer that over from tank to tank until you get to your final dosage, your final nozzle system for dosage. Typically on the nozzle system, we have about 2 to 3% on variation piece to piece. It's getting better every day with some of the technologies that are emerging to be able to dose gummies. But right now they're about 2 to 3%, which means on a true solution, you're going to get about a 2 to 3% variability on your CU. If you've got a suspension, it becomes that much more important that you have systems and mixing energies in order to mitigate all of the problems that might transpire due to demixing. Taste and texture issues. Now, taste is the biggest one that I've found is the biggest problem. So early on in the game, there was a big push. A lot of it was due to the fact that the FDA was not weighing in on taste. We thought that the FDA and other regulatory bodies were going to want us to intentionally make some products like the equate acetaminophen, intentionally taste terrible, that they needed to taste like medicine so that it would deter children from taking them. That has since gone away. I would say within the past year, we've seen a complete shift in that strategy. Every client that has come to us, every retailer that has come to us has all said, we will not put a gummy on the market unless it tastes pristine. Not good, pristine. They're very adamant about that. That is a very big shift. And what that does is it makes all the formulators in the room just sort of sigh, because we know that is a big, big, huge challenge in order to get some of these APIs to have a pleasant taste to them. So the other thing is the texture that exists there. So texture is another problem that we have whenever some of the solids get too high. So you're going to get a certain bricks that exist. Your soluble solids to your water ratio in order to make the gummy set up is there. But then as you start adding some of your non-soluble solids in suspension, things start to break down a little bit they become void areas within the gel network. So adding high dosages, for instance, of 500 milligram acetaminophen, becomes a little tricky. So the manufacturing costs. Gummies are the fastest growing delivery system out there. We know that. So what are some of the things that make these things so expensive? Well, one of the things is the excipients. If you think about it, a typical tablet may have up to 50, let's call it 50% on a drug load. That means 50% of the tablet is actually excipient costs. And typical tablet might range anywhere from 100 milligrams to 500 milligrams on average. Whereas a gummy, as I mentioned before, is 2 grams to 5 grams. It has about 90% excipients. So you have just more excipients inside of your cost structure. And that's something that my costing people in the back of the room know all too well. You burn through a lot more excipients with a gummy manufacturing. Also, taste masking. So we touched on this a little bit earlier. We do utilize a variety of taste masking. We coat APIs. We also use coacervation, microcapsulation techniques in order to do it. We even do some with ion exchange resins. So, and actually, just so happens our booth is right at the back of the theater here. We do have examples of all of those at our booth. Ion exchange resin, as well as coated, as well as some that use microencapsulation techniques, as well as some that don't use any. They just use flavors in order to mask the taste. The process. So again, the process can become more lengthy. Typical gummy lines are set up for a continuous flow. They're set up to make the cook, transfer it over for the holding kettle, and then right on to depositing, start the next cook for more of a continuous operation. When you start to include things that necessitate shorter mixing times, different mixing energies, for instance, necessitating another tank, starts to break the flow of that. So sometimes your manufacturing times and your throughputs may be a little bit off. So it does lead to the increase in costs there. Finally, in conclusion, so you've listened to all of this and you've decided, wow, I'd really like to get into doing some RX gummies. What should you be looking for? Well, first of all, you need to make sure that the facility you have is FDA approved. And in our experience, there's not a whole lot of those out there. We specifically built our facility for RX gummies. We do RX and we do regulated products, submitted products to the FDA. And so this was a natural to build it at the site, which is already GDUFA paying. It was easy to just add this on. So you need to be looking for a site that's FDA approved. Second of all, does the CDMO actually have developing drug products? That's important because most of the people who have been developing gummies in the candy space, in the confectionery space, they don't have a whole lot of experience doing development programs that would be, shall we say, ready for regulatory submissions by QBD. And so therefore, any experimentation, any sort of development that you might do needs to adhere to some of the ICH-Q8 guidelines that are out there, which easily funnel into, if anybody's ever written any sort of a CMC preparation, you know that it's designed to funnel your all of your development right into your regulatory submission seamlessly. It's just basically your development report, cut and paste into your regulatory different modules. Second, these are going to be used for BE studies, presumably, whether you're doing a 505(b)(2) NDA or whether you're doing a new chemical entity. They're going to be going into clinical studies. So again, it needs to be FDA approved. And lastly, of course, the regulatory submissions. Do you have people that understand the regulatory process? Have they done all these things before? Because that's going to be very important in getting this through, getting it through the approval process to ultimately launch. And then the most glaring of all differences is on the analytical side. So very few confectionery companies have much of an analytical presence. And do you have an analytical department that can develop the methods that support ongoing testing, the testing that's going to be required to support a QBD type of a filing? And then ultimately, when you do market it, in order to have those methods robust enough for ongoing QC testing.
Yes.